Hello there. Welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here. Tonight, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to travel back in time, not just as historians, but as biologists, to a small sun-drenched town in the south of France. We're going to stand beside one of the most famous artists who ever lived and look not just at his canvas, but at the very flowers he painted. We're going to explore the story of Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers, but more than that, we're going to uncover the quiet, remarkable biological secret hidden within them, a tiny genetic anomaly, a mutation that changed the course of art history forever. It's a story about how a single microscopic change in a plant's DNA can blossom into something of breathtaking, eternal beauty. If you enjoy what we do here, this quiet exploration of life's intricate details, I would be so grateful if you'd consider liking this video, or perhaps subscribing. It just helps this little corner of the internet reach others who might need a calm place to rest their mind. And as always, I love to know where you're listening from. It's a lovely thought, all of us around the world, settling down together in the quiet of the night. But for now, that's enough of that. The important work is about to begin. So find that perfect cool spot on your pillow. Let your shoulders relax. Let your hands rest gently by your side. Take a slow, deep breath and let it go. We are about to shrink down, past the noise of our world, past the pages of the history books and into the light of a Provençal summer. Chapter 1. The Yellow House and the Provençal Sun. To truly understand the sunflowers, we first have to understand the sun that grew them, and to understand that sun, we have to journey with a man who was chasing it. In February of 1888, a 34-year-old Dutch painter named Vincent van Gogh stepped off a train in Arles, a small town in the region of Provence in the south of France. He had come from Paris, a city he found draining, a city of grey skies and intellectual sparring that had left his nerves, as he put it, absolutely shattered. He was seeking something restorative, something primal. He was seeking light. Imagine for a moment leaving a world of muted tones, a world of damp city streets, of charcoal grey skies that hang low and heavy, of conversations that happen indoors under the soft, forgiving glow of gas lamps. For 2 years this was Vincent's world, and then he boards a train and travels south, for hours and hours, and when he steps onto the platform in Arles, he is expecting to be met with the gentle warmth of an early southern spring. Instead, he is met with a shock. The landscape is covered in a thick blanket of snow. It was, by all accounts, an unusually cold winter. But even through the cold, something was different. The snow itself seemed brighter here. The shadows it cast were not grey, but a deep, vibrant blue. The air, though freezing, was clear and sharp, not hazy and damp. It was the first hint that the light in this part of the world operated by a different set of rules. This initial wintry surprise was a gift, in a way. It allowed Vincent to acclimate, because when the snow melted and the Provençal spring arrived, it did not arrive gently. It was an explosion. Within weeks, the orchards around Arles erupted in a frenzy of blossoms. Almond trees, apricot, peach, and plum. He wrote to his brother Theo, his confidant and financial supporter, with a breathless urgency. He described the landscape as being painted in the colors he'd seen in Japanese prints, delicate pinks and whites set against a sky of the most startling, brilliant blue. He worked at a feverish pace, setting up his easel in the middle of these orchards, trying to capture this fleeting, violent beauty. This wasn't just a change of scenery for him. It was a profound physiological and psychological shift. Our own biology is deeply tied to light. The cycles of day and night, the intensity and color temperature of the sun, govern our hormones, our moods, our very perception of reality. For Vincent, who was already a man of extreme sensitivity, this move from the north to the south was like turning up the dial on his entire sensory apparatus. The world was suddenly rendered in high contrast, in full saturation. The sun of Provence is not the gentle, diffuse sun of northern Europe. It is a powerful, almost brutal force. The atmosphere there is often clear of the industrial haze that softened the light in Paris. The sun's rays arrive on the earth with an unfiltered intensity. At midday, the light is so white and so strong that it can seem to bleach the color out of the landscape, flattening everything into stark planes of light and shadow. The shadows themselves are not mere absences of light. They are deep, cool pools of cobalt and violet. Vincent wrote about this revelation that shadows were not black or grey, but full of color. This is a scientific reality, of course. The light in a shadow is reflected light from the sky, from surrounding objects, and it carries their color information. But to truly see it, and to have the courage to paint it, was revolutionary. Think of the human eye as a fantastically complex biological camera. The retina is the sensor, covered in millions of photoreceptor cells, the rods and cones. The cones are responsible for color vision. In the muted light of the north, the palette of stimulation is limited. But here in Arles, under this relentless sun, Vincent's cones were being flooded with a spectrum of light so intense it must have felt like a physical impact. He began to see colors that others, more accustomed to this light, might have overlooked. He saw the yellow in the sun-baked earth, the orange and violet in the dusty roads, the myriad greens in a single cypress tree as it twisted towards the sky. He described this experience in his letters. He wrote of a sun, a light that, for want of a better word, I can only call yellow, pale sulfur yellow, pale lemon, gold. How beautiful yellow is. He wasn't just observing a color, he was experiencing it. For him, yellow became more than a pigment in a tube. It became the symbol of everything he was searching for: warmth, life, friendship, hope, even a kind of divine presence. It was the color of the sun itself, the engine of all life on earth, and he wanted to capture its essence. This quest for yellow, for light, led him to a decision. He needed a home, a base of operations. He rented one half of a small, two-story building on the Place Lamartine. It was modest, with a green door and green shutters, but its exterior walls were coated in a plaster that, under the Provençal sun, glowed a brilliant, welcoming yellow. This became his famous yellow house. And in his mind, this house was not just a place to live and work. It was a biological imperative made manifest. He envisioned it as a hive, a nest. He called it the studio of the South. His dream was to create an artist's colony, a place where painters could come to live and work together, sharing ideas, supporting one another, creating a new kind of art, forged in the crucible of this southern light. It was a deeply hopeful, almost utopian vision. It was his attempt to combat the profound and crippling loneliness that had followed him for most of his life. Like a single bee attempting to build a hive, he poured all of his frantic energy into preparing this home. He wrote to Theo with detailed plans, sketching the layout of the rooms. He bought simple wooden furniture, 2 beds, chairs, a table. He was a frugal architect, making every franc Theo sent him stretch as far as possible, and he began to paint. He painted the house itself, a loving portrait of this place that held all his hopes. He painted his bedroom, a simple, almost monastic space, yet rendered in joyous, vibrant color, and he began to think about how to decorate the guest room. This room was of monumental importance. It was being prepared for a specific person, the painter Paul Gauguin. Gauguin was an artist Vincent deeply admired, and in his mind, Gauguin's arrival would be the moment his dream of the studio of the South became a reality. He would no longer be alone. The hive would finally have its second bee. He wanted to make the room beautiful, a sanctuary, a welcome gift for his friend. He decided he would decorate it with paintings of sunflowers. This was not a casual choice. The sunflower, Helianthus annuus, is a creature of the sun. Its very name means sunflower. Many varieties exhibit a behavior known as heliotropism, where the young flower heads follow the sun's journey across the sky from dawn until dusk. For Vincent, a man who had come south in worship of the sun, what symbol could be more potent? The sunflower was a living embodiment of his pilgrimage. It was a plant that physically oriented itself towards the very source of light and life that he was trying to capture in his paint. So, in the searing heat of August 1888, he began. The sun in August in Arles is at its most punishing. The air is thick with the buzzing of cicadas, a sound that is itself a biological response to the heat. The earth is baked hard, and the fields of wheat have been harvested, leaving behind golden stubble that radiates warmth. This is when the sunflowers are at their peak, their heavy heads nodding in the fields. Vincent would set out with his easel and canvases, often working directly under that sun. We can imagine the physical reality of this, the intense dry heat, the sweat dripping from his brow, the smell of turpentine and oil paint mixing with the scent of dry earth and wild herbs like thyme and rosemary. The relentless glare would have forced him to squint, his pupils contracting to tiny points to protect his retinas. This act of painting was not a calm, contemplative process. It was a physical struggle, a battle to translate an overwhelming sensory experience onto the flat surface of a canvas. He wrote to Theo, "I am painting with the gusto of a Marseillais eating bouillabaisse." There is an almost manic energy in his letters from this period. He was working at an incredible speed, often finishing a painting in a single session. This wasn't because he was careless, it was because he was trying to capture a specific quality of light, a specific mood that would be gone in a few hours. He was painting the life cycle of the flower, its entire existence, from the vibrant, youthful bloom full of potential to the wilting, decaying head, its petals curling, its seeds heavy and ripe. In these first sunflower paintings, destined for Gauguin's room, he saw an opportunity to do something new. He wanted to create a symphony in blue and yellow. He limited his palette, focusing on the incredible range of yellows he could create. There was the pale, creamy yellow of the background, the rich cadmium yellow of the petals, the earthy ochre yellow of the flower centers. He applied the paint thickly, with a technique called impasto. If you stand in front of one of these paintings in a museum, you can see that the paint is not a flat surface. It is a three-dimensional landscape. The ridges and furrows of his brush strokes are like miniature mountain ranges, catching the light. He wasn't just painting the image of a sunflower, he was sculpting it in paint, trying to give it a physical presence, a life force that could radiate off the canvas, just as the sun's energy radiated onto the fields. This period, the summer of 1888, was one of the most productive of his entire life. It was a time of immense, fervent hope. The yellow house was ready. The paintings were lining the walls. He was building his nest, feathering it with brilliant color, waiting for the arrival of his friend. Everything was converging: his personal quest for community, his artistic ambition, and the unique biological and atmospheric conditions of this corner of France. The landscape of Provence was his collaborator. It was not a passive backdrop. The powerful mistral wind, a cold, dry wind that can blow for days, would whip through the valley, forcing the cypress trees to grow in their characteristic twisted, flame-like shapes. Vincent painted this wind, capturing its invisible energy in the swirling, dynamic strokes of his brush. The soil itself, chalky and full of limestone, dictated which crops would grow: the grapes for wine, the olive trees with their silvery green leaves, and the vast fields of wheat whose golden color so obsessed him. And of course the sunflowers. These weren't the perfectly uniform, genetically optimized sunflowers you might see in a modern agricultural field today. These were likely garden varieties, farm-grown flowers, subject to the whims of cross-pollination and the occasional spontaneous genetic mutation. They were individuals. Some were large and majestic, others were smaller. Some were beginning to droop and lose their petals. This individuality is precisely what Vincent captured. He wasn't painting an idealized generic sunflower. He was painting portraits of specific living things, each with its own character, its own story, at a particular moment in its life cycle. This intense focus on the individual, on the character of a flower or a tree, is part of what makes his work feel so alive. He was communing with the biological world in a way that few artists ever have. He saw the struggle and the vitality in a gnarled olive branch, the aspiration in a reaching cypress, and the entire spectrum of life, from glorious birth to dignified decay, in a simple vase of sunflowers. So the stage was set, the artist electrified by a new environment, the house a vessel for all his hopes for the future, and the decorations a series of paintings that were not just still lifes but were hymns to the sun, painted with an almost religious fervor. He had created his own small, yellow world in Arles, a world built of paint and hope, and he was ready to share it. He had poured all the light and warmth of the Provençal sun onto his canvases, hoping it would be enough to finally banish the shadows of his own loneliness. The seeds of his greatest triumphs and his most profound tragedies were all here, germinating together in the warm, dry soil of the south. Chapter 2. A Symphony in Yellow. Deconstructing the series. And so, we must follow him into that world he built. We leave him there, in our minds, standing in the warm, dry soil of the south, with the seeds of his future germinating beneath a relentless sun. But these were not the only seeds. In his hands, he held pigments, minerals ground to a fine dust, and with them he would cultivate a different kind of garden, one that would never fade. He had carried the light of Provence inside, into his little yellow house, and now it was time to let it bloom on canvas. This is where the story of the sunflowers truly begins to unfold, not as a single event, but as a series, a patient and obsessive exploration of a single subject. It's a common misconception to think of Van Gogh's sunflowers as one painting. In reality, it is a family of paintings, a lineage. To understand the ones that burn brightest in our collective memory, the famous bouquets in a vase from Arles, we must first travel back, just for a moment, to Paris. In the years just before his move south, in 1887, Vincent painted his first sunflowers. But these are not the triumphant icons we know. If you were to place a Parisian sunflower painting next to an Arles one, you might think they were painted by two different men. The Paris sunflowers are not in a vase. They are cut, lying on the ground, almost like specimens for study. Two of them, sometimes four. The light is the cool, grey light of the city. The yellows are more muted, earthen, ochres and pale lemons, fighting for their space against shadowy blues and deep greens. The paint is thinner, the mood more contemplative, almost melancholic. He is learning the flower's language here. You can see him studying its architecture, the heavy droop of a severed head, the rough, hairy texture of the stem, the way the petals curl back at the edges as they begin to lose their moisture. He is not yet painting the idea of the sun. He is painting the anatomical fact of a flower. It's beautiful, honest work. You can feel the scientist in him, the naturalist's eye taking notes. He is deconstructing the organism before he attempts to reconstruct its soul. But in Arles, everything changes. The light changes, and so the man changes, and with him the paint. The Paris sunflowers were a quiet study. The Arles sunflowers are a declaration. They are an orchestra tuning up and then hitting a single explosive chord of pure, unadulterated yellow. Let's just pause on that colour for a moment. Yellow. For Vincent, it was more than a colour on the palette. It was a philosophy. It was happiness itself, the colour of friendship, of hope, of the divine light he so desperately sought in the world. And in the south of France he found himself living inside that colour. The sun-baked fields, the plaster on the houses, and of course the towering heliotropes themselves. He resolved to build a world out of it, and he did so with a chemical arsenal of newly available industrial pigments. To say he used yellow is a profound understatement. He used yellows. He conducted a symphony of them. There was the pale, gentle Naples yellow, the colour of morning light through a dusty window. There was zinc yellow, a cooler, greener shade, like the underside of a leaf. And then there was the star of the show, chrome yellow, a brilliant, powerful, almost aggressive yellow. It was a modern colour for a modern painter, a pigment that held the sun's fire within it. But it was also famously unstable, prone to darkening over time. It's a tragic irony that the very colour he used to capture eternal light was itself fleeting, slowly browning with age, a quiet chemical betrayal happening within the canvas over the decades. When we look at the Arles series, we are seeing him deploy this spectrum with the precision of a master composer. He isn't just coloring in a shape, he is building light. He places a stroke of pale lemon yellow next to a thick slash of deep chrome yellow, and suddenly the petal vibrates. It seems to shimmer with its own internal energy. He understood that colors are not solitary things, they speak to one another. He sets his blazing yellows against a backdrop of delicate turquoise or a deep, regal ultramarine blue, and the yellows don't just sit there, they leap off the canvas. It's a principle of physics, of optics. Place complementary colors side by side, and they intensify each other. For Vincent, this wasn't just a technical trick. It was a way of painting an emotional truth, the feeling of being dazzled by the sun. And the way he applied that paint, this is where we must move from looking to almost touching. Van Gogh's technique is called impasto, which is simply the term for applying paint so thickly that it stands up from the surface, creating texture. But what Vincent did with it was something else entirely. His canvases are less like paintings and more like low-relief sculptures carved from pure pigment. Let your eyes drift over the surface of one of the Arles bouquets. The vase itself is often rendered with smooth, flat strokes, a solid foundation. But the flowers are alive with texture. Each petal is a single decisive gesture, a ribbon of thick paint squeezed directly from the tube or loaded onto a brush. You can trace the path of his hand, the speed and pressure of the stroke. Some petals are sharp and defined, others are soft, buttery blurs. He's not just showing you a flower, he's showing you the energy it took to create it. And the centers, the seed heads. This is where he becomes truly revolutionary. He moves beyond the brush. He seems to be working with the paint itself, a raw material. The seeds are a constellation of thick, individual dots and daubs of ochre, brown and orange paint. They form a rough, tactile surface that catches the light in 1,000 different ways. You can almost feel the weight of it, the dense, packed energy of a flower head pregnant with seeds. In some, you can see him dragging the wooden end of his brush through the wet paint, incising lines, creating a web of texture that feels almost like a living system. It is so physical, so tangible. You feel that if you were to touch it, you might get pollen on your fingers. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. He was trying to replicate the coarse, bristling reality of the thing he was looking at. He was painting its very essence, its rugged vitality. The compositions evolve as well, telling a story across the series. He began in August of 1888, working at a feverish pace, hoping to decorate the yellow house for the arrival of his friend, the painter Paul Gauguin. The first paintings show a full, glorious bouquet, 12, 14, 15 sunflowers packed into a simple earthenware vase. They are a chorus of life, each flower an individual character. Some face us head-on, like open, honest faces. Others are in profile, showing the green, protective bracts on their underside. Some are still in bud, tightly coiled promises of yellow. Others are in full, radiant bloom. The arrangement feels informal, as if they've just been gathered from the field and placed lovingly in the pot. This is hope. This is a welcome. This is Vincent offering his friend the very sun itself. But as you move through the series, subtle shifts occur. He painted repetitions, variations on the theme. In some, a flower has begun to wilt. Its heavy head, burdened with seeds, bows down. The brilliant yellow petals have turned to a brownish rust color. They are limp, their life force fading, and a few petals have fallen onto the table, small yellow tears on the wooden surface. It is so tempting for us to read this as sadness, as a premonition of the decay and tragedy to come in his own life. And perhaps there is a whisper of that there. But through the lens of a naturalist, something else emerges. Vincent isn't just painting life and death. He is painting a life cycle. The vibrant, sun-worshipping flower and the wilting, seed-shedding flower are not opposites. They are two essential parts of the same beautiful, continuous story. One is a moment of glorious energy projected outwards. The other is a moment of quiet contraction, of creating the next generation. Look closely at the wilting flowers. He paints them with just as much love and attention as the triumphant ones. The textures of the dying petals, the complex somber colors of decay, they are rendered with a profound tenderness. He sees the beauty in the entire process. The shedding of seeds is not an end, it is a new beginning. It is the flower fulfilling its ultimate purpose. In these paintings, Vincent, the man who so often felt disconnected from the world, is showing us a deep, intuitive understanding of the interconnectedness of all living things. He paints them against simple backgrounds. Often it's a flat plane of color, a wall of pale turquoise or royal blue. This was a radical choice at the time. It removes the flowers from any specific context, from a cluttered room or a detailed landscape. It isolates them, elevates them. They are not just flowers in a room, they are icons against a field of pure color. They become universal symbols. The simple, humble vase, often signed simply Vincent, becomes an altar, and the flowers become a sacred offering. So we have the evolution from Paris to Arles, from specimen to icon. We have the symphony of yellows, a scientific deployment of color to create an emotional response. We have the sculptural, living texture of the impasto, paint applied like living tissue. And we have the narrative of the life cycle, the celebration of bloom and decay as part of a single beautiful whole. He was painting these so quickly, sometimes finishing one in a single morning session, chasing the light. You can feel that urgency in the canvases. This isn't the slow, patient layering of an old master. This is a frantic, passionate attempt to capture a fleeting moment of beauty before it fades. He wrote to his brother Theo, filled with an almost manic excitement, describing his plans for a whole studio decorated with nothing but sunflowers. A symphony in blue and yellow, he called it. Think of him there, in his small studio, surrounded by these canvases, the thick, oily smell of the paint, the heat of the day still radiating from the stone walls. He is not just painting flowers, he is wrestling with the very substance of light, trying to pin it down, to give it form and weight. Each painting is an experiment. What happens if I place the vase here? What if the background is lighter? What if more of the flowers are going to seed? He is asking questions with his brushes, and the canvases are his answers. He is deconstructing the world into its fundamental elements, color, light, texture, life and death, and reassembling it into something more real, more emotionally true than reality itself. This series of paintings is his great thesis on the nature of existence, told through the humble language of a common flower. And as we continue to look, as we let our minds settle into the thick, swirling rhythms of his brushstrokes, we can start to see what he saw. Not just a bouquet in a vase, but a universe in a jar. A dozen small suns, burning with a quiet, desperate and eternal flame. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Gardener's Anomaly. The Botany of Helianthus annuus. And yet, before we can truly understand the artist's vision, we must first understand his subject. Before we can appreciate the emotional truth of that eternal flame captured in oil paint, we must first get to know the quiet, biological engine that powers the real thing. To understand the poem Van Gogh wrote with his brush, we must first learn the grammar of the flower itself. So let us, just for a while, step away from the museum wall. Let's leave the quiet halls of the gallery and travel back much further in time, and much further west, across an entire ocean. We are going to trace the story of this humble sun, not as an icon of art, but as a living, breathing organism, a traveler, a provider, and a masterpiece of natural engineering. Its scientific name is Helianthus annuus, a name that is itself a small poem. Helios, the Greek word for sun, anthos, the Greek word for flower, and annuus, a simple Latin acknowledgement of its life story. It is an annual, a creature that completes its entire journey from seed to seed within the span of a single year, the sunflower that lives for a season. Its story does not begin in the sun-drenched fields of Provence or in the manicured botanical gardens of 19th century Europe. It begins in the Americas, likely in the arid regions of what is now Mexico and the southern United States. Here, long before it was ever a subject for a painter, it was a partner to humanity. For thousands of years, Native American peoples cultivated this plant. They were the first to see its potential, to guide its evolution. This was not a flower grown for beauty alone, it was a pillar of life. The seeds, rich in oil and protein, were a vital food source, ground into flour for cakes and breads, or pressed to release their golden, life-sustaining oil. But the partnership went deeper. The vibrant yellow petals were used to create dyes for textiles and ceremonial body paint. The strong fibrous stalks were used as a building material, a kind of natural lumber. The leaves and heads were used in traditional medicine. The sunflower was a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a hardware store, all growing on a single sturdy stalk. It was a profoundly practical and deeply integrated part of civilization, a silent, generous collaborator in the human story. When the first European explorers arrived in the Americas, they encountered this remarkable plant. They saw not a utility, but a novelty. They collected its seeds not for sustenance, but out of curiosity, tucking them into pockets and chests alongside other strange treasures from a new world. And so the sunflower began its second great journey, crossing the Atlantic as a botanical stowaway. In the manicured gardens of 16th century Europe, it was an alien marvel. It grew taller and more robust than most familiar flowers, its head impossibly large and seemingly staring at the sky. It was a curiosity for aristocratic botanists and wealthy patrons who collected exotic species as a display of worldliness and power. For a time it was little more than a living trophy, a beautiful but strange immigrant finding its footing in foreign soil. But the sunflower is a patient and adaptable traveler. Its utility, so well understood in its native land, was eventually rediscovered. It found a particularly welcoming home much further east, in Russia. Peter the Great, it is said, was so taken with the flower during a visit to Holland that he brought seeds back to his empire. There, in the vast open steppes, the sunflower found a landscape that echoed its ancestral home. The Russian Orthodox Church during Lent forbade the consumption of many oily foods, but this newcomer, this American flower, was not on the list. And so the cultivation of sunflowers for oil exploded. Through careful selection and breeding by Russian agronomists, the plant was transformed. The heads grew larger, the seeds more numerous, and far richer in oil. The humble sunflower, once a wild American plant, then a garden novelty, had become a global agricultural powerhouse. By the time Vincent van Gogh picked up his brushes in the south of France, the sunflower had completed its grand tour. It was both a common agricultural crop, grown for its oil and seeds, and a beloved garden ornamental, a symbol of summer's warmth and rustic beauty. It had journeyed from the Americas, been a curiosity in Spain, found an industrial home in Russia, and settled as a cheerful, familiar face in the gardens of France. It had many identities, a food, a commodity, a symbol. But beneath all of these human projections, it remained what it always was, a marvel of botany, a complex and beautiful machine for living. And it is this machine that we must now, very gently, take apart. Let us begin with the foundation. If you could feel the stalk of a mature sunflower, your fingers would meet a rough, sturdy surface. It is covered in tiny, coarse hairs called trichomes. These are not just for texture, they are a multi-purpose toolkit. They serve as a defense, making the stem unpalatable to many grazing animals and a difficult terrain for small insects to navigate. They also help to trap moisture, reducing water loss in the hot sun, and can even reflect some excess sunlight, acting as a kind of built-in sunscreen. The stem itself is a masterpiece of structural engineering. It needs to be strong enough to support what will become an incredibly heavy head, laden with seeds, and to withstand the force of the wind in an open field. Inside this stalk is a complex network of plumbing. Bundles of xylem act like microscopic pipes, drawing water and dissolved nutrients up from the roots, sometimes over 10 feet into the air, a silent, powerful internal river flowing against gravity. Alongside them, bundles of phloem carry the sugary products of photosynthesis down from the leaves, delivering energy to every part of the plant, from the deepest root tip to the developing seeds in the head. It is a skyscraper and a city's utility grid, all in one. From this central stalk emerge the leaves. They are large and heart-shaped, typically with a rough, almost sandpaper-like texture. Their arrangement on the stem, a pattern known as alternate phyllotaxy, is no accident. Each leaf is positioned to capture the maximum amount of sunlight without shading the ones below it too much. They are nature's own solar panels, perfectly angled for efficiency, and like a solar panel, their entire purpose is to convert light into energy. On the underside of each leaf are thousands of microscopic pores called stomata. Think of them as the mouths of the plant. They open to breathe in the carbon dioxide needed for photosynthesis, and in the process, they exhale oxygen and water vapor. This process, this quiet breathing, is what powers not just the sunflower, but nearly all life on Earth. The network of veins you can see on a leaf's surface is its transportation grid, carrying water to the cells and carrying the manufactured sugars away to be stored or used. It is a vast, silent and intricate factory, performing a form of alchemy that humans, for all our ingenuity, have never managed to replicate so elegantly, turning sunlight, water and air into life itself. Beneath the soil, a story just as complex is unfolding in the dark. The sunflower grows a primary taproot, a thick, strong anchor that drives deep into the earth in search of water. From this main root, a fibrous network of smaller roots spreads out, exploring the surrounding soil for nutrients. But the roots are not alone in their work. They form a partnership, a symbiotic relationship, with vast networks of underground fungi called mycorrhizae. The fungi act as an extension of the root system, a web of impossibly fine threads that can penetrate soil far more effectively than the roots themselves. In exchange for a small amount of sugar from the plant, this fungal network provides the sunflower with water and essential minerals like phosphorus and nitrogen. It is nature's own quiet underground internet, connecting plants and sharing resources in a silent subterranean community that we are only just beginning to understand. Now, let us move upward to the main event, to the part of the plant that gives it its name and its fame, the flower head. And here we encounter one of botany's most beautiful and profound deceptions. What we call the sunflower flower is not a single flower at all. It is an illusion. It is in fact an inflorescence, a composite head made up of hundreds or even thousands of tiny individual flowers, all arranged with breathtaking mathematical precision. To look into the face of a sunflower is to look at a perfectly organized city, a dense and bustling metropolis of tiny individual lives working together for a common purpose. This floral city is divided into two distinct neighborhoods. First, there are the residents of the glamorous outer ring. What we call the petals are actually individual flowers called ray florets. Each yellow petal is a single, complete, albeit sterile flower. Their job is not to reproduce, but to advertise. They are the bright, brilliant billboards of the sunflower. Their color a specific shade of yellow that is irresistible to bees and other pollinators. They are designed to be seen from a great distance, a vibrant shouting invitation. Come here. There is food. There is life. They are a triumph of marketing, a visual spectacle created for the singular purpose of attraction. But the true heart of the city, the place where all the important work gets done, is the central disc. This is the neighborhood of the disc florets. And here, nature's artistry becomes truly staggering. The tiny individual flowers that make up this central disc are arranged in a pattern of interlocking spirals. If you look closely, you will see spirals curving out from the center to the left, and another set of spirals curving to the right. And if you were to count these spirals, you would almost always find that the numbers belong to the Fibonacci sequence, 21 and 34, or 34 and 55, or even 89 and 144 on the largest of sunflowers. This is the most efficient way to pack the maximum number of florets into a given space, ensuring that each one has enough room to develop. It is a solution of pure mathematical elegance, a pattern that echoes in the shape of pine cones, seashells, and spiral galaxies. It is the universe's favorite design, written in the language of flowers. Each of these hundreds of disc florets is a perfect miniature fertile flower. It has its own tiny petals, fused into a tube. It has male parts, the stamens, which produce pollen, and a female part, the pistil, which contains the ovary that will, if pollinated, become a seed. And the blooming of this city is a slow, deliberate, and beautiful event. It doesn't happen all at once. The florets begin to open in a wave, starting from the outer edge of the disc and slowly progressing toward the center over the course of many days. This is a brilliant strategy. It creates a prolonged window of opportunity for pollination. A bee visiting the sunflower on Monday will find a ring of fresh, open flowers offering nectar and pollen. When it returns on Wednesday, that ring will have begun to fade, but a new inner ring will have opened, offering a fresh meal. It's like a week-long festival, a progressive banquet, ensuring that no matter when the pollinators arrive, there will be something waiting for them. It maximizes the chances of every single tiny floret being visited, being fertilized, and fulfilling its destiny to become a seed. But perhaps the most famous and most misunderstood behavior of the sunflower is its relationship with the sun itself. The phenomenon is called heliotropism, or sun tracking. We have this romantic image of fields of sunflowers, their heads all turning in unison to follow the sun as it arcs across the sky. The reality is a little more subtle, and in many ways even more interesting. This dramatic sun-tracking behavior is primarily a feature of young, growing sunflowers. The mature, heavy-headed flowers, like the ones Van Gogh so often painted, generally stop this daily movement and settle into a fixed position, usually facing east. In the young plants, the mechanism for this movement is a marvel of biological hydraulics. It's not the whole plant that turns, it's the stem just below the flower head that bends. This movement is driven by differential growth. On the side of the stem away from the sun, cells elongate more rapidly, pushing the head towards the light. This process is controlled by auxins, a class of plant hormones which are sensitive to light and accumulate on the shaded side of the stem, stimulating this growth. But it's not simply a passive reaction to the light. The sunflower has an internal clock, a circadian rhythm. It doesn't just react to the sun's position, it anticipates it. As evening falls, the plant doesn't just stop. It slowly begins to turn its head back to the east during the night, ready to greet the morning sun as it rises. It remembers where the sun will appear. It is a plant that keeps time. The evolutionary advantages of this behavior are profound. For a young, growing plant, maximizing sun exposure is critical for photosynthesis, the engine of its growth. By tracking the sun, it ensures its solar panels, the leaves, are always operating at peak efficiency. But for the mature flower, the reason for facing east is more about temperature. By facing the morning sun, the flower head warms up much more quickly than the surrounding air. And what loves a warm, sun-drenched landing pad on a cool morning? Pollinators, bees and other insects are more active on a warm flower. An east-facing sunflower becomes the most popular cafe in the field at breakfast time, attracting significantly more visitors than a flower that is still in the cool morning shade. It is a subtle but powerful advantage, a way of using the sun's warmth not just for energy, but as a lure, a welcome mat for the very creatures it depends upon for its own future. And that future is the ultimate purpose of this entire intricate design. The sunflower's life is a closed circle, a complete story told in a single season. It begins as a seed, technically a fruit called an acane, with a tough, protective outer hull. Inside this shell lies a tiny, dormant embryo, a complete plant in miniature waiting with all the stored energy it needs for its great beginning. When conditions are right, the warmth of the soil, the presence of moisture, it awakens. A root emerges, anchoring it, and then two initial leaves, the cotyledons, push their way up through the soil, reaching for the light. Then begins the period of rapid vegetative growth, the plant's adolescence. It is a race against time, a furious construction project, building the stalk, the roots, the leaves, the entire factory before the peak of summer arrives. Then the signal is given. The plant shifts its focus from growth to reproduction. The flower head forms, a tight green bud at first, then slowly unfurling to reveal its magnificent sun-like face. The weeks of flowering and pollination are the climax of its life. The air around it hums with the work of bees, each visit a tiny act of fertilization, a promise of the next generation. Once this task is complete, the plant enters its final phase, senescence. This is not a failure, but a final, deliberate act of profound purpose. The brilliant yellow ray florets wither and fall. The great head, now heavy with the weight of developing seeds, bows down as if in reverence. All of the plant's remaining energy is redirected from the leaves and stem and poured into one last great task, provisioning its children. Each fertilized disc floret swells, its ovary developing into a plump acene, packed with rich oils and proteins. It is a factory shutting down its daily operations and meticulously packing all of its valuable assets into secure, time-proof containers. Finally, the stalk turns brown and brittle. The life force recedes. The plant dies, but it has achieved a form of immortality. Its seeds will fall to the ground or be carried off by birds and other animals, dispersed to find new ground. The parent plant's body will decay, returning its organic matter to the soil, becoming the very nutrient that will feed the generation to come. It is a perfect self-contained cycle of birth, growth, reproduction, and a generous return to the earth. This is the sunflower that science knows, the common, wild, and cultivated Helianthus annuus, a creature of mathematical precision and solar devotion. A single sturdy stalk, a large orderly head, a perfect city of florets ringed by a single brilliant corona of ray petals. A life spent following the sun in its youth, and then settling down to face the dawn in its maturity. This is the template. This is the blueprint for a normal, healthy, successful sunflower. And this is where our mystery truly begins. Because when you turn back from the field, back from the textbook, and look again, truly look at the flowers that Van Gogh painted in his little yellow house in Arles, you may begin to notice that something is different. Something is not quite right. The flowers in his vase are often shaggy, chaotic. They don't have a single neat ring of petals. They appear to have multiple, overlapping layers, creating a dense, ruffled, almost pom-pom-like appearance. They look less like a simple, open-faced sun, and more like a starburst, a floral firework caught mid-explosion. Was this just the artist's eye, his famous expressive brushwork, reinterpreting reality to suit his emotional state? Was he simply painting the ideal of a flower, an exaggerated, more sunflowery sunflower? Or was he, with his unwavering commitment to painting what he truly saw, documenting something else? Was he painting a real biological anomaly, a strange deviation from the blueprint we have so carefully laid out? Was he, perhaps without even knowing it, painting a mutant? The answer lies hidden not just in the history of art, but in the very code of life itself, in the quiet, elegant language of genetics. And it is into that invisible world that we must travel next. Chapter 4. The Genetic Secret. Unlocking the double flower mutation. That invisible world, it isn't some distant ethereal realm. It's right here. It's inside the seed you hold in your palm. It's coiled up, impossibly tightly within every single cell of the stalk, the leaf, the petal. This world is written in a language of just 4 letters, a chemical alphabet that spells out every instruction for what it means to be a sunflower. And like any language, it can be read, and like any text copied over and over again for millions of generations, sometimes there are typos, misprints, changes in the script that can alter the story in the most profound and beautiful ways. To understand the mutation that so captivated Van Gogh, we have to become genetic detectives. Our crime scene is the canvas, the oil paint now cracked with age. The evidence is the strange, ruffled flower he painted. But the culprit, The cause of this beautiful deviation is hiding in plain sight, deep within the sunflower's genetic code. And so, our investigation begins where all good botany begins, by looking closely, very closely, at the object of our fascination. First, let us revisit the blueprint of a normal sunflower, the one we sketched out in our minds earlier. Remember that the head of a sunflower is not one single giant flower. It is a masterpiece of biological architecture, a composite of hundreds, sometimes thousands of tiny individual flowers called florets. It is a city of flowers, all living together, each with a specific job to do. In this city there are two distinct neighborhoods, two types of citizens. Around the outermost edge you have the ray florets. These are the showstoppers, the ones we think of as the petals. They are long and bright yellow, and their sole purpose is advertising. They are sterile billboards, shouting with their vibrant color to every passing bee and butterfly, "Come here, there is nectar here, there is pollen here." They are the welcoming committee, the beautiful waving banners on the city walls. They cannot make seeds themselves. Their job is purely to attract the pollinators who will make new life possible for their neighbors. Then there is the vast, sprawling center of the city. This is the disk, and here live the disk florets. If you look closely at the dark heart of a sunflower, you will see it is not a flat surface at all. It is a breathtaking spiral, or rather two interlocking sets of spirals, a perfect mathematical arrangement of hundreds of tiny tube-shaped flowers. Each of these disk florets is a complete functioning flower in its own right. It is fertile. It has its own tiny petals, its own male and female parts. It is here, in this dense, orderly downtown, that the real work gets done. It is these humble, tightly packed florets that will receive the pollen, that will fertilize, and that will each transform into a single precious sunflower seed. So we have two distinct identities, the sterile, showy advertisers on the outside, and the fertile, functional workers on the inside. A clear division of labor. This is the standard, time-tested plan for a successful sunflower. Now let's turn our gaze to the flower on Van Gogh's canvas, and to its living relatives which we can find today in gardens and flower shops. They are often called teddy bear sunflowers, a wonderfully cozy name for their appearance. They look like soft, fluffy pom-poms of pure sunshine. The great, dark, seed-producing eye is gone. In its place there are just more and more and more yellow petals, a chaotic, joyful explosion of color that fills the entire head of the flower. What we are seeing is not the addition of something new. We are seeing a revolution, a change in city planning. The citizens of the central disk have forgotten their role. The quiet, industrious disk florets, which were supposed to be small, tubular, and fertile, have started behaving like their neighbors on the edge. They have begun to grow long, yellow, showy petals. They have adopted the identity of ray florets. It's a city where everyone has decided to work in advertising, and no one is left to run the factories. The result is visually spectacular, a sphere of pure golden light, but it comes at a cost. These flowers are often entirely sterile. In their quest for outward beauty, they have lost their ability to create the next generation. For centuries, this was just a curiosity for gardeners, a beautiful quirk. But for modern scientists, looking at those famous paintings and then at the living flowers, the question was irresistible. What is happening on a molecular level to cause this identity crisis? How do you convince a disk floret that it is a ray floret? The investigation moved from the garden to the laboratory. Scientists took samples from normal, wild-type sunflowers and from these double-flower mutants. They began the painstaking process of reading their genetic scripts, letter by letter, comparing the two blueprints to find the difference. Imagine having two versions of an encyclopedia, each thousands of volumes long, and looking for a single critical typo that changes the meaning of a key article. This is the patient, quiet work of genetics. Using sophisticated technology, they were able to scan the entire genome, the complete library of the sunflower's DNA, and they found it, the difference, the source of this beautiful rebellion. It all came down to a single gene. The gene has a name, a designation given to it by the scientists who discovered it. It is called Psych2C. It's not a name that rolls off the tongue, but its function is pure poetry. Think of this gene as a master architect, or perhaps a conductor of an orchestra. In a normal sunflower, the Psych2C gene is switched on. It is active, specifically in the center of the developing flower head. Its job is to give a very clear command to the cells in that region. It effectively says, you will be disc florets, your growth will be restrained, you will be tubular, you will be fertile, you will focus on making seeds. It is the voice of order, the instruction that maintains the division of labor, ensuring the city functions as it should. It draws the line between the showy outer ring and the functional heartland. But in the teddy bear sunflower, the scientists discovered that this gene, this crucial conductor, had been silenced. When they looked at its sequence, they found the typo. But it wasn't just a simple misspelling. A large, disruptive piece of mobile DNA, what scientists call a transposable element, or a jumping gene, had inserted itself right into the middle of the Psych2C gene. Imagine a clear, concise instruction in a blueprint. Build a small tubular structure here. Now imagine that right in the middle of that sentence, a long, unrelated paragraph from a completely different manual has been randomly pasted in. The instruction becomes nonsensical. It can no longer be read. The foreman on the construction site, the cell's machinery, looks at the blueprint and is simply confused. The order is lost. And so, in the double-flowered sunflower, the Psych2C gene is broken. The command is never given. The conductor never raises the baton. The cells in the center of the developing flower head, in the absence of the instruction to become small tubular disc florets, simply continue with the default program. And the default program, it turns out, is to become a ray floret. It's to grow long and yellow and beautiful. Without that single gene acting as a brake, as a director, the entire center of the flower head erupts into a cascade of petals. Each and every floret that should have been a humble seed-producing worker instead dedicates all of its energy to unfurling a golden banner. The result is a flower that is all advertisement, all glorious, sun-drenched spectacle. And so the mystery that began in a small sun-baked room in the south of France in 1888 was solved in a quiet, climate-controlled laboratory in the 21st century. Van Gogh, with his intense, unwavering eye, was not exaggerating. He was not inventing a more perfect, more sunflowery sunflower. He was a naturalist. He was a documentarian. He was meticulously, faithfully recording the physical expression of a genetic mutation. He captured a snapshot of a jumping gene's handiwork, preserving a biological story in layers of lead-based paint more than a century before we had the tools to read the original text written in DNA. It's a humbling thought, isn't it, that a single random molecular event, a tiny piece of DNA hopping from one place to another inside a plant's cell, could create a form so beautiful that it would inspire one of humanity's greatest artists, and that his artwork would in turn become a piece of historical evidence, a clue that would inspire scientists to uncover the elegant molecular mechanics behind that beauty. It's a perfect loop, connecting art and science across the decades. The artist sees the result of the mutation and is moved to capture its form. The scientist sees the artist's work and is moved to understand its cause. Both are driven by the same fundamental human impulse to look closely at the world, to notice its details, its variations and its wonders, and to try, in their own very different languages, to tell its story. The story of how a single broken instruction can, by pure chance, create not chaos, but a new and breathtaking kind of order. Chapter 5. Cultivating the Curious. Horticulture in the 19th Century. The story of how a single broken instruction can, by pure chance, create not chaos, but a new and breathtaking kind of order. And here, our story turns a page. Because for as long as we have been human, we have not been content to merely witness these new kinds of order. We have felt an irresistible urge to participate in their creation. We see the hand that chance has dealt, and we are moved to pick up the cards and arrange them ourselves. This impulse to guide and shape the wildness of nature towards a form that pleases our eye or serves our needs is the very soul of agriculture, of gardening. But in the 19th century, particularly in the Europe that Vincent van Gogh knew, this impulse blossomed into something else entirely. It became a cultural obsession, a science, an art form, and a frantic, feverish pursuit of the strange. To understand the sunflowers that Vincent saw, to truly grasp why these weren't just random withered specimens but something far more special, we must leave the quiet fields of Provence for a moment and step into the humid, fragrant air of the Victorian glasshouse. We must trade the artist's canvas for the gardener's trowel, because the flowers Van Gogh painted were not just a product of nature's quiet, random lottery. They were the direct descendants of a profound and widespread human fascination with the beautifully bizarre. The 19th century was an age of expansion. Empires were stretching their limbs across the globe, and with them came ships returning not just with spices and silks, but with living treasures. The plant hunters of the era were the astronauts of their day, venturing into uncharted territories, the Andes, the Himalayas, the deepest jungles of Southeast Asia, to bring back botanical wonders that no one in Europe had ever seen before. A new orchid, a strange carnivorous plant, a fern with an impossibly intricate frond. These were not just plants, they were symbols of discovery, of the world's seemingly infinite capacity for novelty. To own such a plant, to successfully cultivate it in the damp, cool climate of England or France, was a mark of status, of worldliness, of intelligence. This led to what we now call plant crazes. The most famous, perhaps, was Pyridomania, the fern madness that swept through Victorian Britain. People became obsessed. They built special, elaborate glass houses called ferneries, designed to replicate the misty, shaded glens where these plants thrived. They went on dangerous expeditions to remote cliffs and waterfalls just to collect a rare specimen. The fern motif appeared everywhere, on pottery, on furniture, on gravestones. It was a cultural phenomenon, and it was all driven by a love for a particular kind of beauty. The beauty of intricate fractal complexity, of the deep chlorophyll green of the shade garden. But as the century wore on, this love for the exotic began to shift. It was no longer enough to simply have a plant from a distant land. The new frontier was not geographical, but genetic. The true connoisseur, the truly fashionable gardener, began to seek out and celebrate plants that were different not because of where they came from, but because of what they were. They began to hunt for the oddities, the exceptions, the beautiful mistakes. They began to cultivate the curious. In the language of the time, these plants were often called monsters or sports, but the word monster didn't carry the fearsome connotation it does today. It came from the Latin monstrum, meaning a divine portent, an omen, something that deviates from the natural order and is therefore worthy of close inspection. And these botanical monsters were a delight. Gardeners would scan their flower beds with a trained eye, looking for the one seedling in 1,000 that showed a flicker of something new. Perhaps a leaf was splashed with white or yellow. This was called variegation, and it was treasured. A variegated holly or ivy was a living jewel. Perhaps a flower which should have had 5 petals produced 10 or 20 or so many they were packed into a fluffy sphere. This was a double flower, a mutation we have already explored, and it was the height of horticultural fashion. Think of the simple wild rose with its 5 delicate petals and its open, honest heart of golden stamens. Now picture the classic Victorian garden rose, an enormous heavy-headed blossom, a swirling labyrinth of 100 petals, so dense you can't even see the center. That is a monster. It is a flower that has, through a genetic quirk, converted the parts it would have used for reproduction, its stamens, into more and more petals. To nature, this is a beautiful dead end. The flower is often sterile, its reproductive purpose sacrificed for sheer ornamental excess. But to the 19th century gardener, this was perfection. It was nature's wild poetry, edited and refined by a human hand into a masterpiece of decorative art. And this passion was not limited to flowers. gardeners sought out plants with flattened fused stems, a phenomenon called fasciation or cresting. A crested cactus, instead of growing as a simple column, would spread out into a bizarre brain-like undulating fan. They looked like sculptures from another world. They celebrated trees that were bred to weep, their branches hanging down in a permanent state of graceful melancholy. They cultivated vegetables in strange colors, purple carrots, striped tomatoes, and competed to grow them to gargantuan sizes. The garden was no longer just a place of peaceful retreat, it had become a living cabinet of curiosities, a theater of the delightfully strange. So how did an ordinary person, an artist living in the south of France, come into contact with such floral celebrities? The answer lies in one of the most beautiful and influential innovations of the era, the seed catalogue. Let's imagine for a moment, it is the late 1880s. You are a gardener in Arles. The winter is fading, and your thoughts are turning to the sun-warmed soil. A package arrives in the mail. It is the new annual catalogue from a great French seed house, perhaps Villemot and Andrieux of Paris, one of the most famous in the world. This is not some simple list. It is a book of dreams. You sit down with a cup of coffee as the morning light streams in, and you open the cover. The paper is thick, and it rustles with promise. Inside, the pages are filled not with photographs, but with breathtakingly detailed woodcuts and chromolithographs, illustrations of impossibly perfect vegetables and flowers, glowing with color. The descriptions are not dry and scientific, they are pure poetry. They speak of lettuces with leaves as tender as the morning dew, of radishes with a peppery fire that enlivens the spirit, of poppies with petals like crinkled silk. And then you turn to the section on sunflowers, tournesols. You see the familiar single-petaled giants, the ones that follow the sun. But then you see something else. Listed under the novelties, the special selections for the discerning gardener. Perhaps it is called tournesol à fleur pleine, the full-flowered sunflower. Or maybe it has a more evocative name, like Soleil d'Or, the golden sun. The illustration shows a flower head that is not a simple disc and ray. It is a globe of dense, shaggy, golden yellow petals, a complete sphere of sunshine. The description might praise its unusual and highly decorative form, its magnificence in a floral arrangement, and its status as the latest sensation from the gardens of the elite. This was not a rare, undiscovered mutant, this was a commercial product. It was a high-fashion flower, deliberately bred, selected, stabilized, and now sold to anyone with a few francs and a patch of dirt. It was the result of a long chain of quiet collaboration. Some unknown gardener, decades ago, noticed a sunflower with a few extra petals in its center. They thought it was beautiful, so they saved the seeds. The next year they planted them, and from the offspring they chose the one with the most extra petals. They repeated this, year after year, generation after generation, patiently guiding the plant's genetics down a path of their own choosing. They were acting as the agents of evolution, with an aesthetic goal in mind, and eventually their creation was stable enough to be picked up by a commercial seed house, given a fancy name, and disseminated across the country and the world. These catalogues were the internet of their day. They were wish books that spread horticultural fashions from the grand estates of Paris to the humble kitchen gardens of Provence. They created a shared visual language and a collective desire for these new, strange and beautiful forms of life. This desire was amplified by the rise of the Horticultural Society and the Flower Show. These were grand public events. In crystal palaces and exhibition halls, gardeners would compete for prizes and prestige. There were competitions for the most perfect rose, the largest pumpkin, the most vibrant dahlia, and crucially, there were prizes for the most interesting novelty. The gardener who could present a new flower, a pansy with a never-before-seen color pattern, a lily with a unique form, would be celebrated. This competitive environment poured fuel on the fire of innovation. It encouraged nurserymen and amateur gardeners alike to experiment, to cross-pollinate, to try to create something the world had never seen. This brings us to the quiet, patient science that was bubbling just beneath the surface of all this spectacle, the art of hybridization. While Gregor Mendel was conducting his foundational experiments on pea plants in the quiet of his monastery, his work was not yet widely known. But gardeners didn't need a comprehensive theory of genetics to practice it. They worked by intuition, observation, and immense patience. They understood the basics, that the pollen from one flower, when applied to the stigma of another, would create seeds that carried the traits of both parents. Picture a breeder wanting to create a new dahlia. They would go out into the garden on a sunny morning, armed with a tiny soft paintbrush, a pair of tweezers, and some small bags made of muslin. They would select a flower to be the mother plant. With the tweezers, they would carefully remove its own stamens, the little stalks that produce pollen, to prevent it from fertilizing itself. This is called emasculation. Then, they would go to the flower they chose as the father, the one with the color or form they wished to introduce. They would gently dab the paintbrush onto its stamens, collecting the fine golden dust of its pollen. Then they would return to the mother flower and delicately brush that foreign pollen onto its stigma, the receptive surface at the very center. It is an act of incredible gentleness and precision, a quiet, deliberate conversation between the gardener and the flower. After the pollination, they would cover the flower head with a small muslin bag. This was to protect it, to ensure that no stray bee or gust of wind could introduce unwanted pollen and contaminate their careful experiment. And then, they would wait. They would wait for the flower to fade, for the seed head to swell and ripen. They would carefully harvest the seeds, store them in a paper envelope with meticulous notes, and wait for the following spring. And when spring came, they would plant those seeds with a sense of profound anticipation, because what grew would be a surprise. The offspring would be a combination of the parents, a shuffled deck of genetic cards. Most would be uninteresting. Some would be inferior to both parents. But a few, a very precious few, might just be something wonderful. They might have the vibrant red of the father and the robust stem of the mother. They might display a completely new trait, a beautiful accident of genetic recombination. These chosen few would be nurtured, and the process would begin all over again. This is how the endless variety in our gardens was born. It was not a sudden invention. It was a slow, multi-generational process of selection, a partnership between human desire and the inherent variability of life. It's a testament to a particular kind of patience, a faith in the future, a belief that from two known things, something unknown and beautiful can emerge. So when Vincent van Gogh set up his easel in the yellow house in Arles, the world around him was saturated with this culture. France especially was a global centre for horticulture. The French nursery trade was arguably the most sophisticated on earth. A walk through a market, a visit to a public garden, or a glance into the private garden of a well-to-do neighbour would have exposed him to these fashionable floral creations. The double-flowered sunflowers were not hiding in some remote mutated patch. They were there. They were being cultivated. They were part of the visual fabric of his time. He was an artist uniquely sensitive to expressive forms, to things that were gnarled, weathered, and full of character. He painted the wrinkled faces of peasants, the twisted trunks of olive trees, the dramatic swirling clouds of the mistral wind. Is it any surprise then that his eye was drawn not to the simple, common sunflower, but to its monstrous cousin, the flower that was bursting at the seams with an overabundance of life, the one that looked less like a simple flower and more like a celestial explosion, a tangled, chaotic star? In choosing this subject, Van Gogh was doing something profound. Unknowingly, he was documenting the end product of this century-long human obsession. He was painting a cultural artifact as much as a natural one. He was capturing on canvas a living sculpture, co-created by the forces of mutation and the patient, selective hands of countless anonymous gardeners. He saw a flower that was, like him, overflowing with a passionate, almost overwhelming energy. Its form was not the result of clean classical beauty, but of a chaotic, expressive abundance. It was a flower that refused to be simple, and so we see that the stage was perfectly set. The genetic potential for these strange forms existed within the sunflower's code, and the cultural environment of 19th century Europe had created a fervent desire for exactly these kinds of beautiful deviations. The science of selection provided the mechanism to isolate and propagate them, and the engine of commerce, through seed catalogues and nurseries, spread them far and wide. All that was needed was an artist with an eye sharp enough to see their unique beauty, and a soul empathetic enough to feel their wild, vital spirit. The artists of horticulture had spent a century creating the perfect subject, and now the artist of the canvas had arrived to meet it. Chapter 6, From Gratitude to Decay, the Psychological Mirror. And so the stage was set. The raw material, this living sculpture of a sunflower, with all its beautiful chaotic mutations, had been perfected over a century of patient horticulture. It had been distributed across the world, a silent offering of biological potential. All that was needed was an artist, not just to see it, but to understand it, to look past the simple decoration and feel the pulse of its strange and powerful life. And in the sun-drenched south of France, in a small town called Arles, the artist of the canvas had indeed arrived to meet it. But for Vincent van Gogh, a painting was never just a painting. It was a conversation. It was a letter. It was a prayer. And these sunflowers, they were meant to be a symphony of welcome. They were destined for a very specific audience of one, the painter Paul Gauguin. Before the sunflowers, there was the dream. A dream so bright and so hopeful it seemed to cast the entire world in a brilliant chrome yellow. Vincent had moved to Arles in 1888, and with a small inheritance from his uncle, he rented a corner building at 2 Place Lamartine. He painted its exterior a cheerful butter yellow, with green shutters, and it became his sanctuary, his laboratory, his entire world. He called it, simply, the Yellow House. But a house, for Vincent, was not meant to be a solitary fortress. It was meant to be a home, a shelter for a community. He dreamed of creating a studio of the South, a brotherhood of artists living and working together, far from the cold, competitive circles of Paris, a place where art could be made with honesty and mutual support. And in his mind, there was only one person fit to be the co-founder, the abbot of this creative monastery, Paul Gauguin. Vincent revered Gauguin. He saw him as a leader, a master, a powerful and original talent. He pleaded with him in letters. His brother Theo offered to fund Gauguin's journey and stay, and Vincent began to prepare the Yellow House not just as his own studio, but as a palace for a visiting king. He bought 2 beds, simple wooden ones. He bought chairs, a table. He cleaned and arranged and rearranged. He poured all his hope for the future, all his desperate loneliness, all his artistic ambition into this one simple act, preparing a room for a friend. And how do you decorate a room for the artist you admire most in the world? How do you create an atmosphere of pure, unadulterated joy and welcome? For Vincent, the answer was obvious. You fill it with sunlight. You bring the outside in. You bring the fields of Provence into a single, humble bedroom. You paint sunflowers. Let's pause here and truly feel the weight of that intention. These first sunflower paintings were not an exploration of decay. They were not a meditation on mortality. They were an act of profound and almost overwhelming gratitude. They were a celebration. Each stroke of that thick, buttery paint was a word in a love letter to a friendship he prayed would save him. The sunflower, Helianthus annuus, has a built-in symbolism of adoration. In its youth, it exhibits a behavior known as heliotropism. During the day, the young flower head tracks the sun's journey across the sky, from east to west, as if in silent worship. A complex system of motor cells in a flexible segment of the stem just below the bud, called the pulvinus, selectively accumulates potassium ions, which in turn draws in water, causing the cells on one side to swell and the flower to bend. As the sun moves, the process reverses, allowing it to follow. It is a slow, graceful, and utterly devoted dance with its source of life. At night it reorients itself to face the east again, waiting for the dawn. Vincent, who saw a divine energy in the natural world, would have felt this deeply. He saw the sun as a deity, a force of pure creation, and the sunflower was its most loyal disciple. In painting them for Gauguin, Vincent was casting his friend in the role of the sun, a powerful life-giving force around which he, the humble sunflower, wished to orient his own world. The early paintings in the series vibrate with this optimistic energy. Imagine the canvas. The background is a simple flat plane of turquoise or pale blue, a pure sky. The vase is a simple earthenware pot, humble and solid. But the flowers are explosions. They are crowns of fire. He used the newly available chrome yellow pigment, a vibrant, almost electric hue that allowed him to capture the pure essence of sunlight in a way no artist had before. He painted them in every stage of their glorious life. Summer in full, radiant bloom, their faces open and wide, every petal a perfect ray of light. You can almost feel the warmth coming off the canvas. Others are just beginning to open, their heads still heavy with the promise of future light. He paints them with a feverish intensity, the paint applied thick and fast, a technique called impasto. You can see the drag of the brush, the confident carve of the palette knife. These are not delicate, hyper-realistic botanical studies. They are portraits of a life force. They are joy, made visible. He wrote to his brother Theo, "I am painting with the gusto of a Marseillais, eating bouillabaisse." It was a time of manic, joyful creation. He intended to paint a dozen of them, to line the walls of Gauguin's room, creating an entire ecosystem of gratitude. And then, in October of 1888, Gauguin arrived. At first, the dream seemed to be coming true. The two men worked side by side. They talked late into the night, arguing about art, about life, about Rembrandt and Delacroix. They painted the same subjects, like the Arles camps, an ancient Roman necropolis, each capturing it in their own unique style. For a brief, fleeting moment, the yellow house was the studio of the South. But the house was small, and their personalities were enormous. Vincent was passionate, volatile, desperately needy for affection and approval. Gauguin was arrogant, cynical, and domineering. Vincent worked from nature, frantically trying to capture his immediate, emotional response to the world. Gauguin worked from imagination, believing art should be an abstraction, a symbol created by the mind. The friction was immediate and intense. The southern sun that Vincent so adored, Gauguin found glaring and simplistic. The dream of a collaborative brotherhood began to curdle into a tense and claustrophobic rivalry. The yellow of the house, once a symbol of warmth and hope, began to feel like the color of a fever. And as the psychological weather inside that little house began to change, so too did the sunflowers on the canvas. Vincent kept painting them, but now a new, more somber note began to creep in. The mirror of the flower began to reflect not just the brilliant sun of gratitude, but also the encroaching shadows of doubt and decay. This is where the biology of the sunflower becomes so profoundly poignant. A sunflower in full bloom is a temporary miracle. Its true biological purpose is not to be beautiful forever. Its purpose is to create seeds. Once the flower has been pollinated, a profound shift happens within its internal chemistry. The plant begins a process called senescence. It is a programmed, orderly shutdown. It is not a chaotic collapse but a strategic reallocation of resources. The brilliant yellow ray florets, the petals, have done their job. They have served as a vibrant advertisement to pollinators like bees. Now they are a drain on the plant's energy, so a signal is sent. A layer of cells at the base of each petal, the abscission zone, begins to weaken. The flow of water and nutrients is cut off. The petals begin to wilt, to curl, to lose their magnificent color, turning a dry, papery brown. And then, one by one, they fall away. The great heavy head of the flower, which no longer tracks the sun but now often remains fixed facing east, begins to bow. This isn't a sign of weakness. It's a response to the incredible weight of the hundreds, sometimes thousands of seeds developing within it. The back of the flower head, the calyx, turns from a healthy green to a mottled, leathery yellow-brown. All the energy of the plant, the water from the roots, The sugars from the leaves is now being pumped into one final heroic task, nurturing the next generation. The flower is, in a very real sense, dismantling itself to build its own future. Vincent, living in the heart of an agricultural landscape, would have seen this process everywhere. He was not an artist who shied away from the truth of nature, and as his own dream began to dismantle itself, he started to paint this truth. Look at the latest sunflowers in the series. The vibrant electric yellows are still there, but they are now often paired with ochres, with murky browns, with deep somber greens. He paints flowers that are past their prime. He shows us the shaggy, disheveled heads where petals have already fallen, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a smile. He paints the drooping stems, no longer able to hold the heavy burden of the wilting head. One of the most famous canvases, now in the National Gallery in London, shows this dualism perfectly. We see a full spectrum. There are flowers in their glorious prime, but right next to them are others that are nothing more than a brown, bristly cluster of developing seeds, their crowns of gold completely gone. The vase contains both life and death, simultaneously. The joy is still there, but it is now tempered with a profound melancholy. The paintings are no longer just a symphony of welcome, they are becoming a requiem for a dying dream. The psychological mirror is now reflecting a brutal honesty. Vincent's own mental state was oscillating wildly. The manic creative highs, where he would paint an entire canvas in a single day, were the sunflowers in full, radiant bloom. But the devastating depressive lows, the crippling anxiety, the terror of his own loneliness, these were the wilting heads, the browning petals, the slow, inevitable surrender to gravity. The tension in the yellow house finally reached its breaking point. In late December, after a violent argument, Gauguin announced he was leaving for good. The exact details of what happened next are lost to history and myth, but we know the outcome. In a fit of despair and mental anguish, Vincent took a razor and sliced off a portion of his own left ear. He wrapped it in paper and delivered it to a local woman, then stumbled back to the yellow house, where he collapsed. Gauguin, finding him the next morning, summoned the police and then promptly boarded a train out of Arles, leaving Vincent's dream and Vincent himself in ruins. The studio of the South was over. The brotherhood was broken. The sun, in Vincent's world, had gone out. When he recovered, when he was released from the hospital and returned to that now terribly empty yellow house, the sunflowers were still there. The paintings he had made with such hope, lining the walls of the room he had prepared for his friend. What did he see when he looked at them now? They were no longer symbols of welcome. They were tombstones. They were a testament to a hope that had withered and died, just like the flowers themselves. But Vincent was never one for simple despair. He was a man who looked for light even in the deepest darkness. He asked Theo to have 2 of the sunflower paintings, the ones with the wilting heads, framed. He began to see them differently. He saw that the decay was not an end. It was part of the story. The wilting flower, in its final act, bows its head and offers its seeds to the earth. It is an act of creation, born from an act of surrender. The life cycle is brutal, but it is also beautiful and unending. In the death of the flower is the promise of 1,000 new ones. Perhaps in his own suffering, in the collapse of his grandest dream, he saw a reflection of this profound natural truth. His own mental state was a cycle of brilliant manic creation and devastating wilting depression. He could not have one without the other. The joy and the sorrow were intertwined, 2 sides of the same beautiful tragic leaf. The sunflowers were no longer just a mirror of his relationship with Gauguin. They had become a mirror of his own soul. They represented his fierce, burning adoration for life, for light, for nature. But they also represented his intimate, painful understanding of suffering, loss, and the inevitability of decay. To call them paintings of flowers is to miss the point entirely. They are self-portraits, not of his face, but of his heart. They are a visual record of a brilliant hope being born, and then a heartbreaking dream dying. They capture the highest highs of gratitude and the lowest lows of despair, often within the same vase, on the same canvas. They are a testament to the fact that in the real natural world, life and death are not opposites, they are partners in a continuous sacred dance. The beauty of the bloom and the sorrow of the wilt are not two different stories, they are two chapters of the same one, a story of a life lived with an intensity that few could ever imagine, reflected in the humble, honest, and ultimately immortal face of a sunflower. Chapter 7. Echoes in Eternity. The afterlife of an icon. And so the story ends. Or rather, a chapter of the story ends with that final textured brushstroke. The life of the artist, poured out in waves of brilliant, unstable yellow, comes to a close. But the life of the painting, the afterlife of that icon, that is a story that was only just beginning. That story does not belong to the artist alone. It belongs to the hands that carried it, the eyes that rediscovered it, and the science that now struggles to keep its light from fading. It is the story of how a humble, honest, and ultimately immortal face of a sunflower began its long journey from a quiet room in the south of France into eternity. For a time there was only silence. After Vincent's death, these canvases, now considered among the most valuable artifacts of human culture, were simply part of a vast, heartbreaking inheritance. They were the vibrant, chaotic, and deeply personal effects of a beloved, troubled brother. They were rolled up, stacked against walls, first in the care of Theo, who would himself pass away a mere 6 months later, utterly broken by his brother's loss. The entire collection, this universe of swirling stars, blossoming orchards, and brilliant, defiant sunflowers, then passed into the hands of Theo's young widow, Johanna van Gogh Bonga. And it is here, in the quiet determination of one woman, that the second life of the sunflowers truly begins. We must picture her, a widow with a newborn son, in an apartment filled to the brim with the soul of a man she had known for such a short time. Hundreds of paintings, thousands of drawings and letters, a legacy that the world had not only ignored but actively scorned. The art world of the late 19th century had no place for this raw, untamed emotion. It was too much, too bright, too honest. The polite thing to do, the sensible thing, would have been to sell them off for whatever little they could fetch, to store them away in an attic, to move on. But Johanna did not do the sensible thing. She did something far more remarkable. She began to read. She sat down with the immense correspondence between the two brothers, Vincent and Theo, and she pieced together the story behind every canvas. She read of Vincent's hopes, his theories on colour, his deep and abiding love for the simple, profound beauty of the natural world. She read about his excitement in Arles, his dream of a studio of the South, a brotherhood of artists. And she read about the sunflowers. She understood that these were not just decorations, they were declarations. They were symbols of gratitude, of light, of a life force that burned so intensely it could barely be contained by the edges of the canvas. She became the first curator, the first archivist, the first champion of Vincent van Gogh. She understood that to make the world see the paintings, she first had to make them hear the man. She painstakingly organized the letters, translating them, preparing them for publication. She knew that the voice in those letters was the key that would unlock the heart within the paintings. And while she worked on the letters, she began, with incredible patience and strategic foresight, to show the art, not all at once. Not a flood of overwhelming color, but a careful, curated trickle. She loaned a few pieces to small exhibitions. She invited critics and artists to her home, allowing them to sit with the paintings, to feel their energy not in a sterile gallery, but in a living space. And the sunflowers, they were always a centerpiece. Imagine seeing them then for the first time, not as a world-famous icon behind velvet ropes, but as a raw physical object in a Parisian apartment. The sheer thickness of the paint, the impasto, would have been shocking. The colors, still so fresh, would have felt impossibly bright, like Vincent had somehow trapped pure sunlight in his pigments. Slowly, like a seed germinating in the dark, the reputation of Vincent van Gogh began to grow. The story Johanna was so carefully cultivating began to take root. Artists began to see the genius in his work. The Fauvists, with their wild use of color, saw in Vincent a spiritual father. The German Expressionists saw a forerunner who had dared to paint not just what he saw, but what he felt. And through it all, the sunflowers became the emblem of this revolution. They were the banner of this new art, an art of pure emotion. Johanna lived to see the beginning of his fame. She saw his works enter their first museums. She saw the world begin to understand. When she passed away, the stewardship of this incredible legacy was taken up by her son, Vincent van Gogh. He continued his mother's work, culminating in the creation of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, a permanent home, a sanctuary for the majority of his uncle's work. And so the sunflowers found their homes. The original Arles series, those explosive bouquets, were scattered by the winds of history. One, the first version with 3 flowers, traveled to a private collection in the United States. Another, a grand canvas with 15 blooms against a turquoise background, found its way to Munich. A third, perhaps the most famous of all, the one with 15 flowers against that iconic yellow background, went to the National Gallery in London. A fourth would eventually land in Tokyo, and a fifth tragically was destroyed in a fire during an American air raid on Japan in the Second World War, a sun extinguished by the fires of human conflict. The versions he painted later, the repetitions, found their own prestigious homes, one in Amsterdam, another in Philadelphia. They were no longer just paintings, they had become destinations, they were secular relics. People would travel across the world and stand in a quiet, hushed gallery, just to be in their presence. To see them in person is a different experience entirely. No photograph, no print can capture the physicality of them. You can see the rhythm of the brushstrokes. You can see the sheer sculptural weight of the paint he applied, often straight from the tube. It's less a two-dimensional image and more a low-relief sculpture of paint. You can feel the energy, the urgency, the desperate race to capture the light before it changed, to capture the life of the flower before it wilted. You are standing precisely where he stood, seeing the final result of that frantic, beautiful dance. The paintings had achieved a kind of cultural sainthood, but in the late 20th century they were to be canonized in a very different way. In March of 1987, one of the sunflowers paintings, the version purchased for the museum in Tokyo, came up for auction at Christie's in London. The event was a global phenomenon. It was a moment when the worlds of art, culture, and high finance collided in a spectacular supernova. Let us just pause and consider this. The man who lived in poverty, who subsisted on bread and coffee, who had to beg his brother for the money to buy tubes of paint, the man who sold perhaps one painting in his entire lifetime for a pittance, was now the artist whose work was about to shatter every record. The auction room was electric. The bids climbed higher and higher, in increments that would have sustained Vincent for a lifetime, for a dozen lifetimes. The final hammer fell at a price of nearly $40 million. At the time, it was more than 3 times the previous record for any work of art ever sold. The sound of that gavel echoed around the world. It was a moment of profound and unsettling irony. The sunflowers, Vincent's symbol of simple rustic gratitude, had become one of the ultimate symbols of worldly wealth. It changed the art market forever, but it also cemented the painting's place in the global imagination. The sunflower was no longer just a flower. It was not even just Van Gogh's flower. It was now a treasure, an asset, a piece of cultural mythology so potent it could be quantified in a dizzying string of zeros. What would Vincent have thought? We can only guess. Perhaps he would have been horrified by the commerce. Perhaps he would have been bemused by the absurdity of it all. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he would have felt a quiet sense of vindication, a sense that the world had finally seen the value in what he was trying to give them, a piece of the sun, a moment of life, captured in a humble vase. This fame, this immense value, brought with it a new kind of existence for the paintings. They became ubiquitous. Their image was reproduced on everything from posters and postcards to coffee mugs and tea towels. The intense, private vision of a lonely man in a yellow house had become public property, a shared part of our visual language. The mutant sunflower, with its shaggy, chaotic beauty, had become a friendly, familiar face, recognized in every corner of the globe. It is an echo that has grown louder than the original shout, a ripple that has spread far beyond the quiet pond of the art world. But this immortality, this global fame, has a fragile physical heart. The paintings themselves are not just ideas, they are objects. They are linen, wood, and most importantly, pigment. And it is in the very chemistry of that pigment that the final, most poignant chapter of this story is being written. The battle for the sunflowers is now being fought on a molecular level. Vincent's brilliant, signature yellows were a relatively new invention in his time. He was captivated by them. They were the colors of modernity, industrial pigments that offered a vibrancy and opacity that older, earth-based ochres could not match. The specific pigment he fell in love with was called chrome yellow. Its chemical name is lead chromate. It was brilliant, it was affordable, and it allowed him to paint the sun itself. But it had a secret, a fatal flaw, hidden within its chemical bonds. Lead chromate is notoriously unstable. Like a flower, it wilts. Over time, exposed to light, particularly the ultraviolet rays in sunlight, and even in some artificial light, the chrome yellow undergoes a slow, silent chemical reaction. The chromium atoms in the compound are reduced, changing their state, and as they change, the color they reflect back to our eyes changes with them. The brilliant sun-drenched yellow begins to darken. It shifts, almost imperceptibly at first, towards a dull olive-toned brown. The light that Vincent so desperately chased and captured on his canvases is now the very thing that threatens to extinguish it. This is the great, tragic irony at the heart of the sunflower's afterlife. The paintings are, in a very real sense, fading. The suns are setting, molecule by molecule, year by year. And so a new kind of artist has entered the story, the conservation scientist. Their studios are not filled with easels and palettes, but with electron microscopes, spectrometers, and high-powered lasers. Their task is not to create, but to preserve. They are the guardians of the light. To understand what is happening to a painting like sunflowers, they must become chemical detectives. But their investigation has one absolute unbreakable rule: you must not harm the patient. You cannot simply scrape off a sample of that priceless yellow paint to analyze it. The techniques must be entirely non-invasive, and the technology they use is something Vincent could never have dreamed of. They use a technique called X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy. It is like a chemical fingerprint analysis for a painting. A focused, low-energy X-ray beam is aimed at a single point on the canvas. When the beam hits the atoms in the pigment, it excites them, causing them to emit their own unique X-ray signatures. A detector reads these signatures, and it can tell the scientists exactly which elements are present: the lead and chromium of the yellow, the zinc of the white, the cobalt of a blue. They can map out Vincent's entire palette, brushstroke by brushstroke, without ever touching the surface. They can even see the layers beneath, revealing the ghost of an earlier idea he painted over. It is a way of seeing the painting's very bones. To understand the fading more deeply, they use other forms of light. Techniques like Raman spectroscopy involve shining a very gentle, focused laser onto the paint. The light from the laser interacts with the molecules of the pigment, causing them to vibrate in a specific way. It's as if the laser is gently plucking the molecular bonds like guitar strings. The way the molecules vibrate back reveals their exact chemical structure, allowing the scientists to distinguish between the brilliant, stable form of lead chromate and the darkened, reduced form that is causing the problem. They can see the damage as it is happening. Perhaps the most ingenious technique is called microfading. This is how scientists can predict the future. They focus an infinitesimally small, intense beam of light, a single point smaller than the width of a human hair, onto a tiny, almost invisible part of the painting. In a matter of seconds, this pinpoint of light subjects that single spot to the equivalent of decades or even a century of museum lighting. A hypersensitive spectrometer measures the color change in that tiny spot in real time. It is a way of asking the painting, "How will you age?" and getting an immediate, precise answer. It allows conservators to know exactly how much light the painting can safely tolerate, to set the lighting levels in the gallery, not just by guesswork, but with scientific certainty. The result of all this science is the environment you find the sunflowers in today. The gallery is a sanctuary. It is a life support system for a fragile patient. The light is kept incredibly dim, carefully filtered to remove almost all ultraviolet radiation. The temperature and humidity are controlled to within a fraction of a degree, a fraction of a percent, around the clock. The air itself is filtered to remove pollutants that could accelerate the decay of the canvas and pigments. The painting that was born in the blazing, unfiltered sun of the south of France now lives in a carefully controlled twilight world. The goal is no longer to let it be seen by as many people as possible in the brightest light, but to slow its aging as much as possible, to preserve that yellow for as long as humanity can manage. The brilliant, chaotic life of the flower on the canvas is now subject to the most precise and gentle care imaginable, and so we come full circle. The story began with a mutation in a gene, the HASIC2 gene, which created a new kind of sunflower, a shaggy, exuberant bloom that broke the mold. This biological anomaly captivated an artist, himself a kind of human anomaly, who saw in it a reflection of his own intense, brilliant and tumultuous life. He captured it using a chemical anomaly, a brilliant but unstable new pigment that allowed him to paint with pure light. And now, over a century later, the afterlife of that painting is in the hands of science. We study its chemistry, we protect it from the light it depicts, we tend to it with a care that borders on worship. From a mutation in a seed, to a vision in an artist's mind, to a masterpiece on a canvas, to a priceless cultural icon, and now to a delicate patient in the intensive care of a museum. The echoes of those sunflowers, born in a garden in Arles, continue to ripple outwards. They are a testament to the fact that a work of art is not a static object. It is a living thing. It has a life, it has a history, and it has a future. It ages, it changes, and it requires our care. As you settle in tonight, and you close your eyes, perhaps you can picture it. A single canvas in a dark, quiet room in a museum in London, or Amsterdam, or Tokyo. The crowds are gone, the lights are low, and in the silence, the thick yellow paint holds its breath. It holds the memory of a hot sun, of a humble earthenware vase, and of the hand of a man who saw in a simple mutant flower a vision of eternity. And we, the generations that have followed, have become the gardeners of that vision, doing everything we can to ensure that his sun, however fragile, will not fade from the world. We are tending to the ghost of a flower, preserving the echo of a light that shone so very, very brightly, for just a little while.